guys, everyone. Welcome to our 5th session of EURASIA Talks, organized by METO and Karabakh University with the support of Dünyanın Ortası. And today we have great topic and again great guests. And to present our topic and to present our guest, I will give the floor to our co-host Işık Kuşçu-Bonenfart. So Işık Hoca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yulia. Yeah, I'm honored to have Professor Saivetz today, as I met her 3 years ago, I guess, in person. I always followed her articles, writings, publications before, but I had the honor to meet her in Boston at Harvard University. And asked her, taking this opportunity of the pandemics, I asked her to be a guest in our series, and she was kindly accepted our request. And she's Professor Saivetz has been senior advisor to the Security Studies program at MIT, and also a research associate at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, where I was at the time affiliated with as well. Carol has extensive research on Russia, post-Soviet region, and today I guess she'll be talking on a very critical, sensitive issue about how Russia is involved in conflicts in its periphery. And these are 3 cases, I guess, she's going to discuss with us tonight. And I think they will be all very important cases. I'm happy to hear what she's going to share with us. Thank you, Carol. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. I was in Ankara once in my life. Maybe someday I'll get back there. I would love it.
We would love.
So I'm really happy to be here. I hope everybody is well and staying safe. These are really tough times for everybody, but I keep saying if there's a silver lining, it's the ability for me to be in Ankara tonight, or for me to invite speakers to MIT, you know, from around the world when basically they couldn't come to Cambridge. So my topic today is Russian. Yeah.
Before we start, can I remind to our participants, if you are not asking, please make sure that your microphone is turned off, so you will not bother with sounds. And the second, if you have questions, please first write this question to the chat, and then I will, during the moderation, during the Q&A session, I will read this question to the professor. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. So as I started to say, my topic today is Russia's response to the current crises on its periphery. I'm therefore focusing on Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, that's not to say that issues like Russia's continuing policies to absorb Crimea or the ongoing war in the Donbass don't figure into Russian calculations, and I'm happy to answer questions about Ukraine in the Q&A. But what I'm looking at are the new crises, or the so-called new crises. There's currently a debate in the literature about whether Russian policies towards the post-Soviet space are more nuanced than we've seen in the past year, and whether or not that nuance, and I would agree that they're nuanced, represents, in the words of Dmitry Trenin, who is a noted Russian commentator on Russian foreign policy, whether it is a more, quotation marks, mature policy towards the regions. What I'm going to argue is that Russia is basically stuck, and it has limited resources at its disposal, and that therefore it has been forced to change its policy. So I'm arguing against Trenin's particular characterization as this somehow new, better policy. I think it's the only thing that they could do at the moment. In general, I would argue that Russian policy in the post-Soviet space over the last 30 years has been driven by the desire to be a regional hegemon in what they call the near abroad. And in sort of the olden days, going back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, Russia had a number of tools in its arsenal with which to, as I always put it to my students, sort of mess around in the post-Soviet space. One is active intervention in local politics, taking advantage of instability to promote pro-Russian politicians or forces. Russia has also in the past withheld gas and other energy resources to these particularly to the energy-starved states. And in a couple of occasions, as we've seen in Georgia and in the Donbass, there has been overt military intervention. Russia historically claimed that all of the so-called color revolutions, that goes back to Georgia in 2003, Ukraine 2004, actually Kyrgyzstan originally in 2005, were fomented by the West. Therefore, Russia could argue that it was okay for it to respond because this was some kind of Western penetration. And a corollary was that NATO was out to establish itself along Russia's periphery and therefore weaken Russia. This was particularly the argument in Ukraine in the events of Crimea in 2014, where the Russians argued that if they didn't do something, NATO was going to take over the Russian naval base in Sevastopol, which is on the Crimean Peninsula. I think in general, though, and I think this applies in the early period and definitely since 2014, I would argue that Vladimir Putin is viscerally afraid of what I call and what I've been writing people power. That is, people taking to the street to protest authoritarian, corrupt regimes. Now, here we're talking about Georgia, here we're talking about Ukraine, and in 2020, we're talking about Kyrgyzstan and Belarus. So what's the problem? The problem is that there is an example. If the people are successful, if the demonstrations lead to a change in regime, or if they overthrow the regime, what effect would that have on the Russian people who are watching what's going on in the periphery? And I think the question, I've never met Vladimir Putin, I can't tell you exactly what he's thinking, but I would surmise that he would worry that the people were going to come for him next. And this really goes back to the demonstrations in Moscow and other large cities in 2011, when after the Arab Spring and after rigged parliamentary elections in Moscow, there were massive demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest against the rigged elections. And somehow it triggered something, I think, in Vladimir Putin, like, oh my God, the instability is chasing me, they're out to get me. So that's really the background to at least the first two crises that I'm going to talk about. The third crisis, the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, is a separate issue, but I'll talk about that as well. So if Kyrgyzstan and Belarus represent this threat of people power, and again, the concern is that Russia would rather see stable regimes, maybe not the best, maybe not the worst, but as long as whoever's in power is pro-Russian, I think that they would be happy to leave things alone. The war in Nagorno-Karabakh is different because for years, Russia tried to balance between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but this time, in part because of Turkish intervention, the war was significantly different, and it's a striking contrast to the past flare-ups and even the war in 1994. And this time, I think it represents a weakening of Russian power and influence in the Caucasus. If you want to show the first slide. Thank you. I just brought a couple of pictures and a couple of maps. Perfect. All right, so this is a picture of downtown Bishkek at the height of the demonstrations in October of this past year. Now, Kyrgyzstan has kind of disappeared from the headlines, but I think it's an important example. This was the third time since independence that people took to the streets to change their leaders. In effect, only in 2010 did Russia actively manipulate and sort of orchestrate the change in leadership, because then the issue was the US base at Manas, which was used to fight the war in Afghanistan, and Putin wanted the US forces pushed out. In addition, Kyrgyzstan is now a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Remember, this is one of Putin's two big plans to unite the post-Soviet states into some kind of Soviet, that's a good slip on my part, Russian-led bloc. And Kyrgyzstan is also a longstanding member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which Russia created in the 90s and was an attempt to answer NATO. The instability, as in the picture that was just shown, began on October 4th, when in clearly rigged parliamentary elections, several parties linked to the then president won overwhelmingly. And it was clearly a setup, and it was fixed. And protesters took to the streets and stormed the government buildings. And this is just downtown Bishkek. And here is a demonstrator flying a flag. And you can see how many people are out in the streets. In effect, the then president, Janbekov, lost control of the streets, and the Russians got alarmed enough that they sent Dmitry Kozak, who is the deputy head of the presidential administration, to Bishkek to try to mediate some kind of a solution between the then president and the guy, Japarov, who became the leader of the opposition. And Putin is quoted in the press at the time as calling the events a tragedy, this is a direct quotation, and describing how he watched these demonstrations with pity and concern. What happened was that the mediation effort failed and Japarov became prime minister and acting president. He's turned Kyrgyzstan into a highly presidential, i.e. centralized system, and he was elected president just in January. I think what you have to keep in mind is that he's made a lot of sort of populist promises to the people. He's going to increase wages, he's going to increase pensions, there'll be more food, etc. But Kyrgyzstan is really terribly poor. So he is going to have to rely on Russia's largesse, on Russia's willing to give aid in order to meet his obligations to the people. I'm going to come back to each of these, but that's the background to Kyrgyzstan. If you show the picture of Belarus, just to give everybody another. Belarus erupted actually before the events in Kyrgyzstan and are probably much more significant for the Russians. This is just a picture of people, again, taking to the streets. And you need to understand that until about 2 weeks ago, every Sunday, thousands and thousands of people were taking to the streets, not just in Minsk, the capital, but in several of the other larger cities. And what's significant about the picture is the flag or the banner. That is not the sort of politically correct Belarusian flag, which is completely different colors, but these are the old colors, the old style of sort of Belarus before absorption into the Tsarist Empire and then into the Soviet Union. So the head of Belarus is a guy named Alexander Lukashenko, whom you've all probably heard about. Hillary Clinton once called him the last dictator in Europe. He's a former collective farm chairman who's been in power since 1994. And he has managed basically by force to remain in power until today. Belarus has been highly dependent on Russian subsidies. The deal for years was that Russia would sell them oil at highly discounted rates. The Belarusians would refine the oil and then send and sell refined oil products to Western Europe and pocket the change, basically. Russia began to object and has slowly sort of reeled that in and made sure that they get a cut of the action. So that they've been trying to pull Belarus closer to Russia for years. Belarus, unlike Kyrgyzstan, is a founding member of both the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But since 2014, and I always found this really interesting, since 2014, Lukashenko, while on the one hand having all these economic ties and technically military ties to Russia, after the invasion and annexation of Crimea, Lukashenko got scared and tried to pull back. He never condoned the annexation of Crimea. He has refused several requests to host Russian military bases and has really tried hard to maintain some kind of a distance, not necessarily to break free from Russia's area of influence, but certainly to pull further back. One sec. Not yet. Another piece of the puzzle is that as Boris Yeltsin was weakening and was about to turn over power to Vladimir Putin, that Belarus and Russia created something called the Union State. Now, this has existed since 1999 on paper. It really never came into existence. I think that Lukashenko originally signed the agreement in 1999 because he thought that he would somehow succeed Yeltsin and become the head of this new Union State and therefore be the president of Russia as well. Now Putin seems to be pushing it a little bit, but there was a lot of speculation last winter and spring. So say late fall 2019 into early 2020, that Putin would activate the agreement so that he could become the president of the Union State and thereby not violate the Constitution of Russia, which he has since amended. But there was a lot of speculation at the time that this would be a vehicle for him to stay in power. So what happened last August is that there were presidential elections which were clearly rigged, and people took to the streets, as in this picture, to protest. They arrested the opposition. They beat up on people in the streets. They tortured the people whom they arrested. The eventual leader of the opposition is the wife of the original leader, who is in jail. And she is in exile in one of the Baltic states, and I forget which one at the moment, I think Lithuania. But she is a very powerful force, and I didn't bring this picture, but there's a picture of her holding her hand like a heart like this, so that to show that she's with the people and she's with her husband and everything else. So in this case, we've seen real and dramatic violence against the population of Belarus, certainly nothing that's going to endear Mr. Lukashenko to them. But this time, Lukashenko was much more frightened than ever before, and he seems to have decided that he really needs Putin's help if he's going to stay in power. The big question to my mind is, does Putin really want him to stay in power, or has he become a liability? In late September, Lukashenko traveled to Sochi, on the Black Sea coast to meet with Putin. What Lukashenko tried to do was try to claim that all these demonstrators were out there at the behest of the West, i.e. you got to help me because NATO is encroaching on your turf, Mr. Putin. He did receive a loan of $1.5 billion because the Belarusian economy, because of COVID and everything else, is really staggering. And Putin has pushed to rewrite the constitution because it's a highly presidential system. And if he could make it a more parliamentary system, shift the power from the presidency to the parliament, that they could promote another party and thereby get rid of Lukashenko. So if Putin saw this as a way of getting rid of Lukashenko, Lukashenko thought that it was a way of dividing the opposition so that he could stay in power. So nothing really has been done. The constitutional project is allegedly ongoing, but there have been no announcements or anything. Within the last couple of weeks, the demonstrators have called off the demonstrations till spring. It's pretty cold and snowy there, but the issue hasn't gone away. And as I said before, I think that ultimately Putin would like to be rid of Lukashenko, especially now after the violence against the population, because he's really a liability, but it all remains to be seen. So if you could show the map, I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about Nagorno Karabakh and then pull it all together. So if you could show the next map. Super. Okay. So this is a map of the region before the war this last September. Okay, so there's a long history here going back to the creation of the Soviet Union. Nagorno-Karabakh was basically always ethnically Armenian, but Stalin stuck it within Azerbaijan. It was an autonomous region, and it declared independence even as the Soviet Union was collapsing, so that the first war happened in the early 1990s, and when a ceasefire was finally declared, there was never a peace, there was a ceasefire from 1994 on, that left Armenia in control of all of Nagorno-Karabakh. And then if you can see the darker gray are the 7 provinces that surround Nagorno-Karabakh, which is also technically, according to international law, Azerbaijani territory. So this was a slight, to put it mildly, this was a major affront to the Azerbaijani people. There were over 1 million internally displaced persons who moved from Nagorno-Karabakh into Baku and other major cities in Azerbaijan. In 2016, there was a brief skirmish, and then it was all sort of tamped back down, but nothing really changed until this summer. What's really interesting to me as I've watched Soviet policy towards the post-Soviet states is that at first Russia clearly favored Armenia, and this is going back now to the 1990s. Think about it. Armenia shares with Russia the Orthodox faith. Russia has 2 military bases in Armenia. Armenia was one of the founding members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and it has recently joined the Eurasian Economic Union. So Russia kind of said, well, okay, we're in favor of Armenia. Then they began, their policies towards Azerbaijan changed over the same period. Azerbaijan, as you know, borders the Caspian Sea. And when Aliyev, the father, decided that he was going to ask Western oil and gas companies to come in to begin to explore their resources in their part of the Caspian, Russia tried to block it, didn't want a competitor in terms of export of oil and natural gas. Because Azerbaijan became rich from the sale of oil and natural gas, the Russians eventually sold lots of arms to Azerbaijan, and those were cash transactions, whereas the weapons sales to Armenia were always on credits because Armenia is very poor. So things really began to change in 2018 when there was, in effect, a people's revolution of sorts in Armenia. And the current Prime Minister Pashinyan came to power, but only after massive street protests. Again, the people power that I had been talking about before. And Pashinyan is the first of several recent Armenian prime ministers who didn't hail from Nagorno-Karabakh, interestingly enough. There are all kinds of clan structures in Armenia. I don't need to go into all of that. So as Russia had been pushing for some kind of a mediated settlement, Pashinyan kept changing the parameters of what was acceptable to Armenia in terms of what a solution would be. He wanted to include, maybe because he wasn't from Nagorno-Karabakh, but he wanted to include the president of Nagorno-Karabakh in the negotiations. The representatives of Nagorno-Karabakh were never included in the negotiations. They were generally between Armenia and Azerbaijan, either mediated by Russia or something called the Minsk Group, which is France and the United States, etc. I think the one thing that it's really important to note is that Russia never recognized the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Russia always claimed that the Collective Security Treaty Organization treaty that Armenia is a signatory of didn't include the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh because it was Azerbaijani. So even if Azerbaijan were to have attacked earlier than this summer, were to attack Armenia, Russia was saying, not our problem if all they attack is Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijani territory. One last thing, and here's where Turkey comes in. Because Baku made lots of money selling oil and natural gas, Baku has been purchasing tons of weaponry and very sophisticated weaponry, not only from the Russians, but from the Turks and from the Israelis. And they've purchased drone technology from both Turkey and from Tel Aviv. And the Turkish drones were decisive in the war. Can you show the next map? Thank you. Great. So this is a map as of the ceasefire and as of the end of the war. And you can see that Nagorno-Karabakh has shrunk a bit because Azerbaijan has reclaimed it. Azerbaijan definitely reclaimed those 7 territories that, the 7 provinces that surrounded Nagorno-Karabakh, and the map and the power balance between the 2 states has significantly changed. There's even some speculation that Putin allowed the war to drag on. This was an Azerbaijani attack on the 7 provinces moving towards Nagorno-Karabakh, because Putin allegedly was so annoyed at Pashinyan for continuing to change the parameters of what would be an acceptable peace arrangement. After several attempted ceasefires, some that we tried to negotiate, some that the Russians tried to negotiate, Putin eventually managed to negotiate a ceasefire, and this map is the result. So Armenia has now withdrawn from the 7 provinces and even from part of Nagorno-Karabakh. The Lakhshin corridor, it's marked on the map, is to be patrolled by Russian troops. That's the corridor that's between Armenia proper and the Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh. They've also talked about creating a 30-mile corridor between Nakhichevan. Now, if, on this map, if you look at it in the lower to my left-hand corner, there's a darker gray area. That is an ethnically Azerbaijani territory that's sort of part of Azerbaijan, but it's not contiguous, as you can see, to Azerbaijan itself. So there's now going to be a 30-mile corridor that winds along the border with Iran to connect Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan, and that is also going to be patrolled by Russian troops. And if you show the next picture, please. Thank you. They have another part of the agreement is a joint Turkish-Russian monitoring center that has been established. And here you can see from the flags, Turkey and Azerbaijani troops greeting each other. The interesting thing is that not one letter of this agreement, let me put it that way, touches the status of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So they've separated the troops, they have returned territory to Azerbaijan, but there is no resolution to Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So I'm going to come back to all of this. You can unshare the screen for a moment if you want. Perfect. I'm going to try to wrap it up by talking about where this leaves Russia and why I see this as actually weakening Russia, or being emblematic of a weaker Russia. I think for Kyrgyzstan, the issue is less severe. Any leadership in Kyrgyzstan has to be basically subservient to Moscow. They are wholly dependent on subsidies from Russia. There are 1 million Kyrgyz who work as foreign workers in Russia, at least until the pandemic, and who are sending remittances home, so that the Kyrgyz economy is really very dependent. Russia now has 2 bases, including the one that they took over from the US, and Kyrgyzstan's only other option, given its geography, would be China. And there's a lot of reluctance to get too involved with Russia, and there's some, with China, sorry, and there's some resentment there. I think the Belarusian question is much more intractable, because Russia doesn't want to intervene militarily, but it's retaining the option to intervene militarily. They recently signed an agreement with the Belarusians that either could carry out law enforcement operations, quotation, if such assistance is of interest to the other, i.e. the option is there for Russia to claim that, well, Lukashenko wanted our help and therefore we're sending in the troops. What is happening, and it's also a contrast with what happened between Crimea and now, is that there are monthly joint military exercises between the Belarusian army and the Russian army, which means that there are indeed Russian troops on Belarusian soil, even as I'm giving this talk today. Putin has signaled that he doesn't want to do that, and he doesn't want to intervene more directly. At a recent CSTO meeting, he said, hopefully the Belarusians can sort this out by themselves. i.e. Mr. Lukashenko, do something to make the problem go away so that we don't have to do something that's more forceful. Where I think the weakness lies for the Russian position is that at this point, 30 years out from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and believe it or not, it's 30 years this year, neither population is looking for unification. The Belarusians have established an identity of their own. More and more of the population is using Belarusian instead of Russian. They see themselves as a distinct political entity on the world stage. And the Russians, given the fact that the Russian economy is suffering because of COVID and because of sanctions, don't want to see Russia subsidized to any greater extent than it already is. Don't want to see Russian money going to keep propping up Lukashenko or keep propping up Belarus more generally. In terms of the Caucasus War, the Kremlin has lost a ton of support in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, whereas Armenians once looked to Russia as their great savior. Certainly Russia allowed the war to go on and then intervened only late in the game, and the Armenians have suffered a terrible defeat, and there have been massive demonstrations against Pashinyan, calling him a traitor, saying he gave up the Nagorno-Karabakh cause. And if you buy my argument about the fear of people power, this must incredibly unnerve the Russians and Vladimir Putin. They've kind of kept this guy in power even though they didn't love him. And the last thing they want is somebody or another leader to be brought to power by people power who possibly could undo the ceasefire arrangement if, you know, a more ardent nationalistically inclined leader were to come to power in Armenia. And at the same CSTO meeting that I just mentioned, Putin urged the other states, the other members of the CSTO, to back Pashinyan and to applaud his courage in accepting Armenian defeat. Now think about how sort of backwards that is, like buck him up a little bit, that, as we say in the United States, so that you know, he doesn't feel too bad and the people don't feel too bad about all that they have lost. As I said at the beginning, there are lots of commentators who argue that Russia's sort of winning. Russia's stronger. Russia's more deft at its policies in the near abroad. And these people also argue that because Russia now has troops deployed in Nagorno-Karabakh, there are 2,000 Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh itself. And before this, there were only a minimal number of troops at 2 small bases in Armenia. But I'm not convinced that even this is a plus. On paper, it looks great for Russia. They now have more troops in the region. But it raises all kinds of questions. Could these Russian troops protect both Muslim and Christian holy sites? Think about that. I mean, there's real almost civilizational antipathy between the two populations, and both sides have claimed that the others destroyed churches, mosques, etc. And what can the Russian troops, how could the Russian troops intervene to protect those sites? What is the actual role of the peacekeepers? There have already been multiple violations of the ceasefire, and if there are more and sort of larger violations of the ceasefire, what does that mean for the power of the Russian troops, and could the whole thing break down? The agreement that they signed was for 5 years. Suppose in 5 years there is no, I grant you this is highly speculative, but there's no agreement about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So Baku would be well within its rights to ask Russian troops to withdraw. So if the Russian troops withdraw, would Azerbaijani troops overwhelm Nagorno-Karabakh? Could the troops, or could Russia protect the ethnic Armenians who've chosen to stay there? If Russia refuses to withdraw, do they alienate Aliyev or whoever succeeds him in Baku? I think that it's very fraught. Yes, there were 2,000 troops more than there were 6 months ago on the ground, but I think their roles not clearly delineated, and I think that they are under pressure from all sides, and it's not clear that it's a great win for Moscow because there are tough choices ahead. I wanted to say a couple of words about Turkish-Russian relations and then try to pull this all together. As I'm sure you guys well know, Russian-Turkish relations are complicated at best. They cooperate sometimes, they compete sometimes. There are obvious differences of policy in both Syria and in Libya, even as Russia tried to engage the Turks and the Iranians in the Astana peace talks about Syria, which got nowhere. What really stands out to me in the last couple of months is Erdogan's willingness to challenge Russia. If you think about, on the one hand, you guys have bought the S-400s, the surface-to-air missiles, which is great, and NATO's rather upset about that, and the United States is rather upset about that. On the other hand, Turkey is challenging Russia in Libya, where they've just declared a ceasefire, but we'll see what really happens there. In the Caucasus, Turkey is now a player, and I was thinking about this. If you go back to the Georgian war in 2008, Turkey at that point, Erdogan at that point was talking about some kind of Caucasus stability arrangement, some kind of pact among the sort of Black Sea states and everything else. Nothing really ever came of it, but I think that Erdogan has aspirations in that direction as well. And as I said, the Turkish troops have been deployed to the joint monitoring station as of December 30th of last year. But it's really interesting to me that the Turks were almost brazen in their activities during the war. There were reports of Turkish planes and soldiers being involved in the war itself. It's not just that Azerbaijan bought Turkish drones, which fired on Armenian soldiers and tanks, etc. It's that Turkey may have been directing some of the war. Not clear, but some of the war. The New York Times dubbed this sort of an uncomfortable arrangement. By some accounts, the Turkish intervention during the war surprised Moscow. And almost all of these are all Russian commentators whom I'm citing now. All of the Russian commentators say that Turkey has emerged as an important regional player. And I don't think I would have said that 6 months ago or a year ago. So where does this leave Russia? I think that Russia actually has a lot to learn. I'm not sure that Putin and his entourage understand that the post-Soviet states have changed in 30 years of independence. I don't think they understand the nuances of politics and forces in many of those states, be it Kyrgyzstan or Belarus, etc. Russia's going to confront in Belarus the idea that the Belarusians have developed a national identity that is distinct from sort of the Soviet man and distinct from being part of the Soviet Union. And I think the same is true in all of the other states. I think Russia's calculation today, and it's probably an oversimplification, seems to me to be that what Russia wants is stability. They don't want any more instability. They certainly don't want demonstrations of people power, but the stability should somehow lean in a pro-Russian direction. The old system didn't work. What did the CSTO do? Armenia was a member of the CSTO from the beginning. They never invoked it. It didn't do anything. Would there have been Muslim states like Kazakhstan that would send troops to help defend Armenia against Azerbaijan? I mean, you could think about the sort of multiplicity of problems that the CSTO presents. The other issue that I raised before, and I think it's even more important now, is a lot of these states like Armenia, like Kyrgyzstan, and like Belarus are very poor. Will Russia spend what it takes? Will they provide aid? Will they provide subsidies to the economies of these states in order to buy support for a pro-Russian position or a pro-Russian leader in wherever state we're talking about? Again, I'm not sure, to use Trennan's word again, that this is a mature policy. I think the reality is really very different from this idea that Russia somehow evolved and it's being so sophisticated in its foreign policy these days. I think Russia is weaker than it wants to admit. COVID is ravaging the country. There was an article last week that indicated that the mortality rates are much higher than Russia has been willing to admit to. The Russians have really had a failed response. I don't know how else to put it even now. And what aid has been given to the population has been centered in, you know, Moscow and St. Petersburg. I don't know what's happening in Turkey necessarily, but here there's a huge debate now about COVID relief, how it's targeted, to whom should it be given? Should it be given to state and local governments? How about people who've lost their jobs or small businesses that are struggling? In Russia, the debate has been, well, it's not getting beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's not getting out to where the bulk of the population lives in Siberia and some of the other parts of the Russian Federation. What funds Russia did have, instead of being given out as aid to the population, has gone into what they call their stabilization fund, which means that they're still saving for the rainy day, kind of in case it gets worse, but they're not preventing it from getting worse in the short to middle term. Consumer sentiment is failing, living standards are falling, real wages are falling, and some of this predates COVID, but an awful lot damage has occurred because of the pandemic. I would also argue that the so-called Crimea effect has waned. You know, Russian population was, and Putin's support was bolstered by the annexation of Crimea. Most of the population there is Russian speaking. It historically was part of the Russian Empire. I don't think any of these other places is as important symbolically to the Russian population as Crimea was. And so there's no support for the union state with Belarus. There would be no support for sending in more troops or giving more aid to Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, etc. I think that Putin may want to hold sway, as we say, in the post-Soviet space, but he really lacks the support from the population and the wherewithal to do that. Can you show the next slide? Thank you. Okay, this is Alexei Navalny after his poisoning and when he was recuperating in the hospital in Germany. So the picture that I've just presented was about COVID, and you have to add to that, that in the middle of the pandemic, you have the whole Navalny episode. And as many of you know, Navalny was poisoned with Novichok, which is a nerve agent, allegedly at Putin's request. And the reason people think that it was at Putin's request is that they know that the security services were involved in the actual poisoning. And because this is a nerve agent, a chemical weapon that was developed by Soviet authorities, it's under state control. So there had to have been somebody who said, okay, take this stuff and go and put it in Navalny's underwear, which is actually how the poisoning happened. And since then, he went to Germany to recuperate. And then I think he was a very brave soul. He returned to Moscow and was immediately arrested. And he has tremendous gall, and I give him credit if you just want to show the last slide. Thanks, Julia. This is supposedly Putin's palace on the Black Sea coast. So the day after Navalny was arrested, he released an 2-hour film, which if you Google it, you can find and watch. That's a picture of the interior, and it supposedly has many levels underground, so Putin can get to the water of the Black Sea without having to go outside, basically. There's a heliport, there's a pole dancing studio, God knows who uses it, etc. And it costs many billions of dollars, quite literally. So I think that if on the one hand you have COVID and the impact on the Russian economy and the average Russian citizen, combined with the impact of the sanctions post-Crimea, and this is what's circulating around there on the web and everything, with pictures of the lavish lifestyle that that Putin lives, it is spurring discontent. Now, since Navalny's arrest, there have been demonstrations in Moscow and other major cities. And again, they've tried to use force this time, and they've arrested something like 10,000 people. So I would argue that Putin is acting out of weakness and not acting out of strength. For some reason, Navalny really scares him. And I think it's because it's revealing the corrupt underside of the so-called power vertical, and it's Putin and his cronies who've gotten rich while everybody else has become increasingly impoverished. And support for Putin is definitely declining. Now, just to conclude, let me be clear. I'm not arguing that Russia is, as we say in the United States, going to pack its bags and go home, that Russia is not going to continue to seek to influence policies in the surrounding post-Soviet states. But I am arguing that it's not maturity that's changing Russia's policies, but it's a way of not getting overly invested and of trying to find less costly ways of playing some of the same political games that it was playing previously. And again, I mean, some of this is highly speculative. If Putin is really worried about staying in power, even though he's amended the Constitution, if he's worried that the people are turning against him, it may just be that staying in power at home is more important than anything that he could possibly do in any one of the other states. Again, remember that the Crimea effect has worn off. So just to conclude, I have a great quotation from a Russian study of public opinion that predates COVID, but by only a couple of months. And the author of the study noted, and I'm quoting here, continuing stagnation in the economy and lower incomes have undermined confidence in the regime, and foreign policy mobilization, i.e. let's get Crimea and everything, and propaganda no longer compensate for the economic negative. So if Crimea was used to bolster Putin's popularity in 2014, there is no other place, would be my argument, that would have the same effect on public opinion. He's mishandled COVID. We have all this information from Navalny's anti-corruption campaign. And I think Russia's in bad shape. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really enlightenment presentation and comprehensive one from different part of the region. And we have questions, and probably I will give the question first to Professor Ayata, because it's for her first question. So please, Professor Ayata, the floor is yours.
Oh, so you expect me to give, thank you very much, Carol. It was very interesting. I very much enjoyed it. I mean, there are a number of questions, but I should really give the floor more to the students and to younger colleagues. But I really want to know, I mean, your notion of people power is extremely interesting. I mean, many of the authoritarian leaders in the world are really very much afraid of the people power, as you have said. And it seems to be the crux of the matter, really, in terms, because probably because the elections can be more manipulated, then the people power becomes more and more important. So I want to ask you about this people power and United States. And as there is a new administration in United States now, do you think that the new administration will give more support, well, not directly, of course, I don't think it will be directly, but indirectly to this people power in that region? May it be in Belarus, may it be in Russia, may it be in Kyrgyzstan, or any one of those countries?
I think it's a double-edged sword because, as I said, Putin, starting with Georgia in 2003 and then Ukraine the first time in 2004, kept charging that it was somehow NATO or Western influence. It was democracy promotion that led the people to the streets. But in that era, Putin could clamp down or could manipulate the situation to his advantage. I think it's very different now, as I said, because I think Russia is weaker. I also think that it's not always to the advantage of the opposition to say, well, the US is backing us up or NATO is backing us up, because then it becomes a target. They become
certainly not.
Right, it becomes an increasing target. But Biden has already criticized the treatment and the jailing of Navalny. I mean, yeah, Biden has criticized what happened to Navalny. Trump said nothing. We have to remember that. And I think that the US will try to back the Belarusian opposition, but has to do it discreetly, because if you give credence to the argument that, well, the West is behind all of this, Putin then has an excuse to go in and do whatever he might do. So it's a tough balance. I mean, remember during Maidan in late 2013, when Victoria Nuland was out in Maidan Square handing out sandwiches to the demonstrators, it was read by Yanukovych and by Putin as, well, the West is there helping us, it's obvious. That's it. And even if you go back to 2011, when Hillary Clinton praised the demonstrators after the rigged Duma elections in December of 2011, Putin again took that too as the West is out to get me. So I think it has to be a very, very nuanced policy where we can support, obviously, democracy and human rights, et cetera, in the abstract, but we cannot be seen as trying to unseat any, whether it's Erdogan, unseat any of these leaders specifically. We can criticize policy, we can levy sanctions. It'd be interesting to see whether the Biden administration levies sanctions against Belarus. I know they're talking about it because of Lukashenko's really severe, harsh beatings of so many demonstrators and everything. Will they put more sanctions on Putin because of the Navalny case? I don't know the answer to that question, but they have to figure that out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and we will continue our discussion. Probably the next question will be from myself, if it's okay for the rest of the participants. Actually, it's more like remarkable, not the real huge question. You mentioned that I mean, there is some speculation about the Russian actually winning in the near abroad. I mean, the Russian policy is going good, but I mean, you try to show not in that way. And there is a speculation that the protests in Belarus actually by somehow they make Lukashenko more dependent from Putin. Yes, or it's like maybe not the direct game of Putin, all these protests, but by somehow it's in Putin interests, in spite if it's even looks if it's like more democratic and everything. So can you comment on these kind of speculations?
I think short term, I agree with you insofar as Lukashenko has stopped distancing himself from Russia and he's sort of been reeled, like a fishing reel, reeled back into the fold. I am not sure, however, that longer term that's an asset for Russia. Lukashenko is increasingly unpopular. If he stays in power, if he continues to have demonstrators beaten and jailed and tortured and everything, the population will increasingly turn against him. And then they're facing the same problem that they faced last summer and fall. I think that the Russians have a couple of choices. I don't think the Russians want him to leave power immediately. Because if he leaves power now, it will be seen as a direct result of the demonstrators, in which case people power will have succeeded. That's why there's this whole plan afoot, allegedly, to create some kind of new constitution that would allow for a more parliamentary rather than presidential, highly presidential system. And then there is room for maneuver. The Russians could back a parliamentary party and have, if they're parliamentary elections, make sure that party wins, something like that. It gives them more room to kind of ease Lukashenko out. Right now, I think, even though he's being very compliant, I think he's a long-term liability for them. And in effect, he always has been. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, sure. And one more, a small question connected to this. Okay, let's suppose that by somehow the protesters are succeed. Yeah, so there is a change of power in Belarus. What kind of the next potential leader, what kind of relations will be with Russia? Because generally in all post-Soviet states, we see these like protesters against Russia. We see this in Georgia, we could see this in Ukraine, but it seems that in Belarus, we don't have this type of opposition that is actually against Russia. At least Tikhanovskaya herself say that I'm not against Russia as in the rest of the state. So let's suppose, okay, power shift happened. What kind of relations will be with Russia? How do you think?
I think it depends on how the power shift occurs. I agree with you. Your characterization, I think, is spot on, that in Georgia, particularly after the 2008 war, and certainly in Ukraine post-2014, the so-called opposition is anti-Russian because of what Russia has done to those states. In Kyrgyzstan, it's landlocked, it's basically stuck, I don't mean literally, but it's stuck in this pro-Russian position. So Japarov has said, oh, we're not anti-Russian, we love you, Russia, please help us. The opposition in Belarus did not start out being anti-Russian. I don't think it's made that turn yet, but should they somehow back Lukashenko, or he stays in power because they can't get rid of him and he's perceived as having Russian backing at the same time as the demonstrations pick up again in the spring, I think then you're going to see a shift in the tone of what the demonstrators are demanding. And that's why I said, I think Russia really lacks understanding of how the politics of all of these states have changed in 30 years. Whether you don't want to make trouble with Russia or whether you hate the Russians or whatever, you are a Kyrgyz citizen, you are a Belarusian citizen. And I think there's increasing pride in that citizenship and increasing differentiation from having been part of the Soviet Empire. And Russia's still doing it sort of in a black and white way. And I think it really needs to be much more nuanced. So I think it's going to depend on whether Lukashenko stays in power or not, under what conditions he stays in power. If he stays in power but beats up on demonstrators and is seen as being beholden to Moscow, again, I think the tone of what the demonstrators are demanding could shift decisively. So I think there are too many moving parts to answer that question any more specifically.
Thank you very much. And the next question is from Turgut Tuncel. So if Turgut Hocam can read his own question.
Thank you very much for this great presentation.
Thank you.
Actually, you somehow at least partially answered my question, but maybe you would like to add something more. So actually, I want to ask a rather provocative question about Western approach to the protests in Belarus. As we all know, the EU and the US, and particularly the Central and Eastern European EU member countries such as Lithuania and Poland, decisively, robustly supported the opposition.
Right.
And this is the first thing. And then when this protest began, Lukashenko somehow turned towards Russia for support, probably to
Right.
balance the Western reaction to his rule. But the thing is that, as you said, since 2014 or so, there was a difference in Belarusian foreign policy, its approach to West, and it was somehow leaning towards West, probably to balance Russian influence in the country. But when this protest broke out and the West reacted robustly at the side of the opposition, Lukashenko again turned his face back to Russia. So my question is that From within a strategic point of view, if we think strategically, can we think that the West made a mistake by resolutely supporting the Belarusian opposition, which resulted in the melting away of Lukashenko's relative drawing towards the West? Can this be taken as a strategic mistake? So this is my first question. And the second question is that actually you talked about Putin's approach to Lukashenko, and from this point, I would like to ask about Armenia. So, what would be your comment on Putin's approach to Pashinyan in Armenia? Would Russia want a change in power in Armenia, or would Russia prefer to continue with Pashinyan at least for some time? Thank you.
Okay. You know, I'm not exactly sure how to answer your first question. Lukashenko tried to play sort of a bidding war, if you will. He would tilt towards the West. Oh, yes, I'm going to reform. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that in an attempt to get EU assistance. And then he would tilt back towards Russia. And he was pretty successful at it for a long period of time. I think, I'm not sure I would call it a geostrategic mistake as you did. I mean, I don't think Belarus and Lukashenko was ever ready to say, oh, I'm going to join NATO tomorrow, the way Ukraine has now stated, or Georgia. I don't think that was ever in the cards. So I don't know what we have lost, if we've lost anything. My heart personally is with the people in the street. I feel terrible. But I don't think we've lost anything. I think from the Russian perspective, you know, every invasion of Russia passed through Belarus on the way, every invader passed through Belarus on the way in. And so I think for them, it's probably a much more strategic discussion than for the West. I mean, I think they're really concerned about geography. The Russians are concerned about geography. But again, I think the whole NATO threat is overblown in the Russian mind. You know, even in 2014, when they said, oh, NATO is coming, that's why we have to take over Crimea and everything, NATO never made any noises about taking over the base at Sevastopol. That never happened, but it was their fear that a new leader in Ukraine would turn over Sevastopol to NATO, you know, naval forces or whatever. I don't see that. What are we going to do? We need a base in Belarus? We have a base in Poland. We're going to have a base in Poland. We have troops, rotating troops throughout the Baltic states and Eastern Europe. I mean, we don't need Belarus in that sense, the way the Russians, I think, fear that we might want it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's sort of my gut instinct about it. And I just don't see it as a mistake per se. And, you know, the United States, and I can't speak for the EU, the United States has always had this split personality, if you will, between promoting human rights, promoting civil liberties, etc., in any country. I mean, look at the history of the whole post-World War II period, certainly during the Cold War, versus supporting an authoritarian government who was anti-Soviet, let's say, or anti-Russian. And it has always left us in this dilemma. So I think that we're sort of carrying forward. What you're going to hear now from the Biden administration is much more support, at least verbal support, for the demonstrators, condemnation of human rights abuses, condemnation of the beatings and things like that. Maybe sanctions against Belarus. I know the EU was talking about that, but I don't think it's going to go beyond that. I don't think nobody's talking in those kind of very strictly strategic terms. That's my instinct about it. I could be wrong and something could happen tomorrow. The question about Pashinyan is a really interesting one. They don't like him. They've made it clear that they don't like him. They don't like him because he came to power basically through people power. They don't like him because he kept mucking around with all the negotiations that they were trying to promote. I think Russia would have loved to have been the great peacemaker. Absent the war, I think they would have loved to somehow been the ones to get rid of the Minsk group and to talk about how they finally declared peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But Having said that, they are alarmed at the demonstrations against Pashinyan now. I thought it was really remarkable at that CSTO meeting in December when Putin came out and said, okay, guys, we got to support Pashinyan. We got to tell him how brave he was to accept defeat. It's kind of a backhanded compliment. And I think it's for two reasons. One is that it would be more people power. Number one, if Pashinyan is pushed out. And the other thing is if it's a highly nationalistic replacement, Armenia could withdraw from the peace, the peace deal, the ceasefire, and start fighting again. And that's the last thing the Russians want. The Russians are in a better position now than they were, than they would be if the war reignited. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that they're happy with Pashinyan sort of being weakened, maybe more dependent on them, but not out of power.
Yeah, thank you very much. If
Sure.
I have a minute, I would like to say just a few sentences about my first question. Actually, why I asked this question is because of the influence of the Jamestown Foundation's analysis on Belarus. You know, the Jamestown Foundation, and they started.
It depends on who's doing the writing.
Glenn Howard.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Glenn Howard's writings and some other colleagues' writings. Actually, they started a series of articles on Belarus starting from September 2019. And the title of this series is The Growing Importance of Belarus on NATO's Eastern Flank. And the main idea is that, yes, Belarus will never be in the near future, will not be a NATO country, or it will not be a truly pro-Western country, but the point for NATO and US is to keep Belarus as a, let's say, neutral or autonomous country. This is enough for us, they say this. But after these protests, now Lukashenko changed his policy of becoming more autonomous. So this was the reason why I asked the first question. Anyways, thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have one more question, if I may. I'm very sorry, sorry that I keeping you. Okay, so you were talking about the response from Russia to the near abroad. But what about the response of this near abroad towards Russia? I mean, after all this situation with poisoning of Navalny and the protests that started already in Moscow and other cities in Russia, is there any changes in the politics and in attitudes of these near abroad countries, post-Soviet countries towards Russia? I mean, maybe they start to think like, okay, the days of Putin is over, so we have to change our politics. So, I mean, is there anything like that at all?
Not that I've seen. I haven't followed it from the capitals, from Almaty or or wherever, but Astana, I'm sorry. But I think that, let me answer this way. I think that they're probably watching the strength of the Putin regime and wondering, and perhaps wary. Sometimes the devil as we say, is better than the one you don't know, because they know how to deal with Putin. But I think you need to look back at Crimea, 2013, 2014. There were any number of countries who did not accept the actual annexation. And going back, let me go back even further. After the 2008 war, when Russia kind of lopped off South Ossetia and Abkhazia, if you look at the transcripts of the meetings from the CIS, from the Commonwealth of Independent States meetings, from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, etc., you can see that they were very nervous about irredentism and severing different ethnic groups from whatever states they're in. And even the Chinese, because of Xinjiang, etc., were concerned about this Russian activity. So that's 2008. In 2014, as I said, Lukashenko tried to play it very cagily, maybe well, maybe not so well. We could debate about that, but they really tried to say, oh no, we don't support this. We don't want any Russian troops on our territory. We don't want any Russian missiles on our territory. We want nothing. And that was until he himself was in trouble in September. So that held. Even in Kazakhstan, they've been very concerned that first that Russia could pull another Crimea, because, you know, the northern portion of Kazakhstan, if you look at a map, is highly ethnically Russian. And so they're concerned about could Russia start to stir up trouble? Could Russian, you know, operatives start to stir up Russian language issues or stuff like that in the northern part of Kazakhstan? And Nazarbayev, when he was still president, tried to be very careful about that. I think they're just watching warily. As I said, this is 30 years out. They understand the limits of their independence, and certainly the countries that are oil rich, like Kazakhstan, have more room of maneuver than the poorer countries like Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. It would be really interesting. Apparently there was a summit of Pashinyan, Aliyev, and Putin in Moscow in January. And maybe it was Sochi, I don't remember where the meeting was held, and they talked about these very grandiose transportation corridors and everything else in the region. If Armenia could get itself out of being so stuck, that might be good. What role would Turkey play there? And then you get into a lot of ancient history. I think everybody's watching warily and trying to make sure that any one of these other leaders is not also a victim of these massive demonstrations against, you know, against himself in these cases.
And just in case if the protests will be successful, can it be a signal for the rest post-Soviet countries? I mean, authoritarian countries like for Kazakhstan and for sure for Belarus. I mean, if a Russian regime falls, will it mean that Belarus regime will fall automatically?
I think it would depend on who took over in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are any number of scenarios. If it's, for example, one of the oligarchs who has, this is pure speculation, do not take this as the truth or anything that's happening. If, for example, a couple of the oligarchs got together and said, okay, Vlad, you've stolen your $80 billion, go retire to Sochi. We love you. We promise not to prosecute you. Remember, the Russian Duma just passed a law that said ex-presidents cannot be prosecuted. You're safe, leave power. We want to restore ties with the West, etc. And we can't do that unless you do, unless Russia does X, Y, and Z, whatever would happen. That's a possibility, and that might be beneficial towards some of the other post-Soviet states. It's also the possibility that the KGB could say, okay, Putin, you're a liability, we're taking over, and we're going to be harsher domestically. In which case, I think the other states would be exceptionally wary of what is happening within Russia and what the implications would be for them. I honestly don't foresee in the near to middle term anything where there's suddenly this wave of popular revolutions that brings democracy to this part of the world. I just don't see it happening.
Thank you very much. And we have a few more questions suddenly from Eltirishan Elchibey. So if Mr. Elchibey can read his question. If not, I will do this, just so to have a communications with people.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech, Prof. Carol. I would like to ask that, how do you interpret the future of the Kaliningrad Oblast? And could the Belarus crisis have implications for the Suwalki gap that connects the Kaliningrad to mainland? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for you. I think that at least for now, nothing's going to change. I think that Kaliningrad is going to remain an integral part of Russia, especially now that they have the Iskander missiles there and everything else. Russia is not going to let go of it. I don't think Russia's watching Belarus to look at the gap. I don't think that's their issue. I think it's much more this people power that I've described, this idea that you can overthrow a corrupt authoritarian government and take to the streets. I just don't see the Belarusian question in such geostrategic terms as I was asked before, and much more in terms of the politics of the post-Soviet space and Russia's relationship with these other states. Russia's not going to move its troops. NATO's not going to move its troops. No one's looking for war, but we're skirmishing in a lot of different spheres, including cyber, including things like influence in Western Europe and even in the United States, interference, etc. I just don't see anybody saying, okay, well, we need this because we need the troops here. We're not refighting World War II, and we're not refighting even the Cold War. That's my answer.
Okay, great. And the next question will be from Kirill Dovhopol.
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear me well?
I see you. Yes,
Okay.
you're fine.
Good evening, Professor Saivetz. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I have a really important question. How do you think which instrument can be used to destroy Putin's power and monopoly? Thank you.
Say that again. I don't quite.
Which instrument can be used to destroy Putin's power and monopoly?
By whom? Us or the people of Russia?
Like by people or by another country, in your opinion, which instrument or people or another country can be used for this?
My sense, as I've alluded to at the end of my talk, is that the so-called power vertical, which is what they call the Putin system, is crumbling from within. How much more can they steal? Seriously, how much more can they steal? The people are disaffected. I think COVID has landed a real blow on Russia. I don't think there is much that we can do in the West. We can continue sanctions, and there are some people like Navalny's entourage who are arguing for very targeted sanctions against specific oligarchs, etc., to try to bring the system down that way. Maybe that would work. I'm not sure what would replace it. Russia just doesn't, I don't mean to, I wish them well. I love being there. I love all things Russian. Obviously, I've devoted my life to studying the country. I think that Russia doesn't have a history of democracy, really. The brief period, the Kerensky government in 1917, and then you get the early Yeltsin period before things kind of fell apart there. And I would say we in the West mishandled that period. I don't know what would happen if the whole thing just fell apart. I don't know who would take over. Again, I think the options are either one of the oligarchs or a front for one of the oligarchs, the way Putin was for the Yeltsin family, or it could be the military or the KGB, in which case I think Russia and we would be worse off than we are today. So I don't really have an answer to that question, and I'm not sure what tools. We have sanctions. Mm-hmm. And I think nobody's going to fight a war. That's not going to happen. I don't know what else we could possibly use. Yes, we could offer support for Navalny and stuff like that, but we don't know whether that's going to have repercussions that could be negative for the population at large.
And just because, as you know, like previous year, they changed constitution and he became like a king. It's true.
Maybe we don't. You see, what's so interesting is that yes, he changed the constitution, but we don't know that he's going to opt into using those levers to stay in power. There are rumors that he's suffering from terrible Parkinson's disease. The fact that he seems to be such a germaphobe, in his palace outside of Moscow, there's a long tunnel where you have to go through disinfectants if you want to see him and everything. I think the fact that the Duma just passed this law about not prosecuting former presidents, I think all indicate that he may not stay until 2032.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have, I guess, last two questions. Okay. And I guess, Ishikoja, I will give the floor next to you.
I guess the two questions are related to last questions, because my question was also, Carol, your interpretation regarding the recent crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh and how Turkey intervened in this whole situation, and how Russia perceived it. From my understanding, your interpretation based on the commentators in Russian media or elsewhere, and New York Times obviously interpreted as differently, but people seem to be confused, like how Turkey could be so powerful, perhaps, or, you know, have a role in the very Russian near abroad, you know, Russian backyard.
Uh-huh.
And I guess everyone was surprised as well too. So do you think, like, I mean, the way I understand is that you interpreted as, I know these are all, I mean, you did a great job in, like, you know, helping us to put the dots and, you know, in interpreting a lot of these really recent things. It's hard to interpret them, but as you have years of experience in working in this area, you can do it easier. What I'm interested in, how you view that, how Russia sees basically Turkey's position. So is Russia just okay as long as, or Putin, so he kind of like knows or weighs his own power and he's okay with, you know, okay, whatever, Turkey can do this? Or is it like some kind of, between Turkey and Russia, some kind of agreement, you know, hidden agreement, not hidden, but, you know, so I'm very interested in this.
Yeah, you know, the subject of Russian-Turkish relations could be a whole other talk.
That was actually, my suggestion. Let's do that.
Yeah, sure, sometime in the spring. I wrote a paper about a year ago where I talked about Russian-Turkish relations, and there's a phrase in the United States, I call them frenemies.
Uh-huh.
A combination of
Frenemies,
friend and enemy. Because on some issues they have been successful in a sense at using each other to promote their individual goals, and in other places, even though they're ostensibly supposedly cooperating, on the other hand, as we saw in Syria, you know, on the one hand you had the Astana talks, and you also have the issue of the Kurds and everything else happening in Syria, which really tears Russia and Turkey apart. You have Turkey and Russia on opposite sides in Libya, and God knows if this, you know, ceasefire that was declared a couple of weeks ago will hold. I think for now the Turkish role in the Caucasus is minimal, but I don't know what will happen down the road if the Turkey-Azerbaijani relationship continues to grow. More advanced weapons are sold, etc. There's another war, another skirmish. I mean, you know, you could spin this out. I think Turkey's role there would become much more of an irritant than it is now. I know the latest thing is that that Russia is pushing for some kind of revision to the Montreux Convention. I don't know what's going to happen with that. And obviously that's you guys who have control of the straits and everything. It's just not clear to me how this is going to play itself out down the road. I think there are areas where they cooperate and there are areas where they are rivals. There's now new pressure on Turkey about the S-400s, you know, with the Biden administration and everything else. That's also not clear to me. I mean, so Turkey was purposely provocative in going ahead with the sale. I don't know what will happen now. You know, the new administration's been in power for 3 weeks, so I don't know what's going to happen here and how the Biden people will react to it. I think Turkey's trying to have it both ways. And I don't know how successful Mr. Erdogan will be in navigating between these two major rivals.
Thank you. I mean, I guess the same, maybe we'll have another talk on that too. Russia-China relations within the framework of Central Asia and the whole Uyghur issue.
Oh, that's another separate. Yeah,
topic. Let's do another week on that, Russia-Turkey, Russia-China.
Anytime, maybe in person at some point.
Or a round table, perhaps, like for all these.
Sure,
like,
let's be in touch with me. We could certainly talk
Okay.
about it. Because I could get a couple of other people to speak as
that
well.
would be great. Yeah, let's do
Yeah.
that.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
we have just 2 questions left, and actually one of the question you answered partially. So like I will give the floor to Turgut Tuncel, who has last question about the corridor.
You're on mute.
Thank you very much. It's me again. Actually, well, I find your views quite interesting. So that's why I'm forwarding so many questions. So my question is about the recent developing situation in the South Caucasus. So the ceasefire agreement was blocked by Russia, and there were several articles, clauses in that deal, and the 9th article was foreseeing the opening of trade corridors and other connectivities in the region.
Right.
The Nahchivan corridor, Megri corridor, whatever you call it, so on and so forth.
Right.
So my question is, what could be the game plan or plan of Russia by facilitating this kind of corridors and connectivities? What's the game of Russia? What does Russia want in the region?
You know, there's been a lot of talk about sort of north-south connections through the Caucasus for a long time now. There are railroads that are being built. The Iranians are involved in some of it. I haven't seen anything in the last couple of weeks specifically, but I think that if Russia can, if Putin has a strategy, I think that opening those corridors would buy at least stability in the region, because if suddenly there's trade moving that wasn't moving before, if Armenia is not nearly as isolated as it has been over the last many years, if the Iranians aren't so involved in the Khichevan and stuff, I mean, all of those things, I think there's a hope that there is at least some stability and maybe the status quo as of today or as of 6 months from now, something like that. And, you know, the hope would be that the more trade that there is, the more movement of people, the less likely these states would be to go to war again. Then Russia would come out, I think, as the big winner. Because
who is the big winner? Sorry.
The Russians would come out as the big winner because they would have promoted, I mean, that's what this summit was all about last month, this whole idea of promoting trade corridors and stuff like that. Now, remember, it's going south to north. So it would go, and then they can keep Armenia and Azerbaijan, as we Americans say, on side, sort of in a pro-Russian position, and maybe ultimately get rid of the Turks, to go back to the other question. You know, if Armenia and Azerbaijan are beholden to Russia to patrol the corridors and to initiate the trade and everything, then maybe there's less of a role for Turkey in there, which I'm sure in the back of Putin's mind is an irritant. I mean, that would be my answer. I don't think we know enough yet. First of all, they're not real. They're proposals, but they're not real.
Okay, and we have the last question. Actually, it's more like comments that you actually by somehow respond in your previous answers. Just the last part I will read directly, so to save a time, from Sayed Taghizadeh. So he is interested in position of Biden regarding the future of Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, it was a comment, long comment, but at the end, the question
That's
is.
the end. No, you know what, given what's going on in the United States at the moment, and given all the things that Biden has to deal with, I don't know if he's given a thought to Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm sure some of his people in the State Department have, and they've been watching it. I don't really have an answer to that question. I'm sure that they, you know, we've been training troops in Georgia so that our top stake is in Georgia. We have energy relationship with Azerbaijan. We have a huge Armenian diaspora in the United States. So I think that it would be in Biden's interest to craft some kind of a policy, and I don't know specifically what it would be, but some kind of a policy that could perhaps help all three countries in the South Caucasus to maintain their ties with the United States, if not to improve them. I'm sure, you know, we made one stab, the Trump administration made one stab at ending the war that didn't work. The last time they came close to a real peace deal, not just a ceasefire, but a peace deal, was when Colin Powell was in the White House. That's a long time ago. So there is, I think, a role for the United States. I don't know if Russia would want, Russia seems to be wanting to sideline the Minsk group, of which we are a part. So I think that Russia, as I said before, in answer to another question, I think that if Russia could create the stability, maybe by the corridors, maybe just by having a presence there, and cut out the Minsk group and cut out the French and cut us out and everything else, I think Russia would be happier than if the United States had a major role. That doesn't mean that the Biden administration is ultimately going to accept that, but that would be my argument. And again, given what Biden is dealing with here, I can't see that Nagorno-Karabakh is even in the top 15 of what he's worried about in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, I guess that's all questions that we have for today.
Thank you.
And before I give the floor to the last word for the Ishik Hocam, I just want to remind that the recording of this lecture you can watch on Dünyanın Ortası Facebook page right now, and also it will be available on its YouTube channel. So just in case, if you need a recording, you can also send us an email and we will share the link with you. So thank you very much, Professor Saivetz. It was really great discussion, not just presentation, but even discussion, because a lot of questions was posted here. And the last word will be from Ishik Kuşçu-Bonaparte. So please, Ishik Hocam, finish the lecture. And your microphone is muted. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm on, I guess. I mean, I don't know how I could finish it. Obviously, we have still a lot to discuss, but I'm going to finish it because the curfew here is about to start and I have to make it home. And
you have to go get your children.
Yeah, I know. They're probably like making my parents already crazy, but two boys. But definitely, I mean, let's do the I don't know, in other platforms, obviously, we all need to discuss these issues as, you know, Turkey as part of this region, and also, and that we definitely are interested in, you know, what is going on in the region, people from Turkey. And obviously our talk series are getting attention from all over the world. And I'm really glad that we have started this. Carol is like, something, the discussion between me and Yulia, and then Turgut Hoca happily joins, and like basically three people, of course, with the help of all people like you, Professor Firman, and you know, all other great professors pitching in and commenting on how we are doing. And but the, you know, the, I guess the audience, the great interest, without them we wouldn't have the courage to continue these. So we'll keep you updated if you're interested too. Maybe we can plan other events in the future together as well in the spring.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Okay, so we will finish, and before finish, I just will say that we will share next week. We will share the whole program till the summer, till end of June, with EURASIA Talks. So, like, I hope that you will find some interested topics, and you can join also us. Thank you very much for all of you, and I'm finishing the session. See you in the next seminars. Bye bye.
See you. Bye. Night.